It is my distinct pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Sandy Banks. Ms. Banks has been a journalist for over 40 years and is well known for her twice weekly column for the Los Angeles Times, addressing such social issues as education, foster care, criminal justice, homelessness, mental health, and more, and in the process, developing a reputation for serving as a voice for the ignored, unheard, and unknown. Today, her presentation will address They Are Us, shining a light that enlightens and unites. Please welcome Miss Sandy Banks.
Thank you all for having me here today. I want to start, first I just want to say a thank you to a couple people, and one is on behalf of all journalists to Judge Michael Nash, who has led us with his passion and his commitment to transparency, because as journalists we know that we can't tell the story unless we know the story, and we can't do that unless we have access to people, and Judge Nash has championed the rights of children and the rights of families and the rights of journalists, so thank you from us. And on behalf of me, I just want to thank my high school teacher from Cleveland, Mrs. Leila McBath is here, and I hope she'll stand up because thank you. Her daughter and I were friends since junior high school. We were cheerleaders together in junior high and high school. And Mrs. McBath probably is responsible for me graduating because I could not pass trigonometry. And she tutored me and pushed me and scolded me until I got I think I got a D actually, but I made it out, so. When you all invited me, I was a columnist for the LA Times, and now I am not. People keep saying, how do you enjoy retirement? I said, this is unemployment, it is not retirement. But I left because it was time to go, and the transition's been hard. I miss my column very much. It had been a wonderful opportunity for me to learn things, to stand in the shoes of other people and to share their stories. And I also miss my voice when I read my paper. I think this is a world now that is becoming increasingly black and white and good and evil and dark and light, right and wrong. And I always enjoyed kind of working in the grays because I think that's where we live, most of us. We have minds that are busy and that are full of a lot of different thoughts and ideas, and so I wanted to reflect all of that. I came to column writing after being a reporter for many years, and as a reporter, you're taught to keep a distance, and you're also taught to gather all the information and to be very fair and not to just present one view. So I kind of tried to report my stories that way, and I think that leads you to be in the gray because you know there is no one right answer to anything, and I know that my job is not to tell you how to think, but it's really to show you perspectives and people that you might not know. I worked really hard to do that, and I learned a lot in the process. The column didn't start out this way. It was in the feature section. I don't know, some of you may remember, it was almost 20 years ago when it started. And I was supposed to be the counterpart to Chris Erskine, who was the man of the house, as we know. And my column was supposed to be kind of lighthearted and self-effacing. My very first column was about getting my hair dyed so that I would look good in the picture and winding up with 2 orange spots in the middle of my head. So, and it kind of proceeded along those lines, and a lot about my kids and a lot about just being a mom and a woman. I wasn't setting out to save the world. I just wrote about what I knew, and that was about being a single mother of 3 daughters, growing up in suburbia, being a widow, being a person who came from Ohio, where everything was black and white and working class, to California, where everything was kind of technicolor, and there were convertibles and palm trees. And I always kind of felt like an outlier here. I felt like an outlier, and I felt like an outlier in the newsroom. And the process of becoming one of you, one of us, taught me a lot that I was able to later use in my column. I learned 2 things primarily, and one is that what we know really just relies on the limits of our experience. And secondly, that that we really are, that we're more alike than we are different. I think fundamentally, I would sometimes write about something that I thought had nothing to do with anybody but me, and I would get, this is before emails even, I'd get dozens of letters saying, that's just like me, I do that too. And so I began to realize that if we could just connect kind of on that fundamental person-to-person basis, a lot of the fears and the biases and these issues that we had would evaporate. In 85, we moved, my husband and I, we had 1 child then, we moved to Northridge, and we were, as far as I could tell, the only black people in the neighborhood. When I would go on my morning walks, it was not unusual to be stopped by somebody saying, hi, where are you from? I never knew if I should say Cleveland, or we lived in Van Nuys before, or what they meant. But I think they were just, it was uncommon enough that people responded. And my husband and I were very aware of that, and we had, everything was fine until one morning. I came downstairs on Sunday to get the paper, and there was a watermelon on our front porch. And so I went upstairs, I told my husband, okay, it's on, they know we're here. And he came downstairs running and ready to do battle and rushed out on the front yard. And then he looked around and realized that every porch had a watermelon. And that was just how they welcome you, or how they welcome summer in Northridge. The real estate agents put a watermelon on your porch. So we realized that we needed to get over ourselves and just, be part of the neighborhood. And I knew I had made it when one day, we had a very close-knit kind of neighborhood. The lady next door to me was talking to me and complaining about all the Koreans moving into the neighborhood. And I thought, have I been promoted? Or, what am I supposed to say now? We had gone from being the other to being one of them. And I knew what she meant, and she wasn't a bad person. I knew what she meant. She meant somebody like us who did our traditions, because her complaints were about things like they didn't give the right candy at Halloween. And, she didn't know if the whole taking your shoes off thing, So it was just that she didn't know them, and she was, felt at a distance from them. And so I realized that as a journalist that my job should be to kind of create the kind of understanding that comes from getting to know each other. I think that it's easy to judge what you don't know. If you think people are on welfare or lazy if you have a job. You think that poor kids struggle in school because their parents just don't help with homework. Or that black men get shot because they're just big and loud and belligerent. I decided to let my life inform my job, and that there would be lessons everywhere. And one of the first ones would be from a woman that she was my neighbor's housekeeper. She began, by the time I had 3 children, she was helping me. And she became a friend. She taught me Spanish because she didn't speak English. And I was curious about that. You've been here 15 years. How do you not know English? Well, I realized that she had never learned to read and write in El Salvador. She had tried several times to learn English, and it was hard. And that had never occurred to me. She became the first person when my husband died. She was the first person to show up and say, can I help? What can I do? We helped her to bring her children here and helped her to get her legal documents so she could be a legal resident. And the happiest day for her was when she went from cleaning homes to working a factory job because she had her papers. And I couldn't help but think that was the same journey that my mother-in-law had taken when she came from Alabama with a 6th grade education to Toledo. and scrubbed floors on her hands and knees for years and years and years until she got a factory job. And with that factory job, she helped put 5 kids through college and bought a home. And so I realized that there's not much difference between Sylvia, the housekeeper, and Catherine, my mother-in-law. One of my most important teachers, and this is where my foster care interest comes, was she's a young woman now, Trinity Gonzalez, who became friends with my daughter in middle school, was living with foster parents, who she adored, and they seemed to adore her. But several months after we met her, and I remember I had to fill out paperwork for her to spend the night with us and do all kind of things. But about 6 months or so later, they got a chance to adopt a little child, an 18-month-old, and so they needed that bedroom. So Trinity went from being their child, and she called them mom and dad, to living in a group home a few miles away, and she had to change schools because the border was like 1 block away from the school. So suddenly, all the friends that she'd worked so hard to make were lost. She spiraled down from that point on because this is middle school. She's a girl. It was hard to fit in. This was a girl who had been in 9 foster homes by the time she was 12. And her life just kind of spiraled down after that. And she went from group home to foster home to probation, back and forth. She would run away. She would call us. I'd come get her. I'd keep her a few days and take her Penny Lane. If anybody's here from Penny Lane, it was a wonderful place, and that's where she wound up. And I remember taking her once to Penny Lane, and I said, Trinity, you have to stop running away. It's a nice place. They're good people. They care about you. And she was friends with my daughter, Danielle, and she said, would you want Danielle to be there? And I had to say, no, I wouldn't. And I realized that things wouldn't change unless I began to see Trinity in the same way I saw my own child. And that is kind of the mission for all of us, that these are all our children. And her life continued. It's now, I'm not sure whether she was homeless, she was pregnant. She'd always come back when she needed us. But I remember going down for her birthday when she was in a group home, and it was 16th birthday, and we're going to drive to Orange County to go there, and halfway there, we got a call saying, don't come because she's unpunished. She's being locked down because she got mad and threw a telephone. And so she was locked up, and we couldn't see her. And they said, and you should just cut your ties. She's very angry, she's very troubled. And I thought, if I had been moved, if you had been moved to 9 different homes, if you didn't have a single person in your life who loved you, who wasn't paid to love you, wouldn't you be angry? And I have a daughter who was a phone thrower, and she got sent to a room. She didn't get on lockdown and not get to have anything. So I just became more and more aware that these children, through no fault of their own, were living lives that none of us would accept for our own children. And so I tried to bring that sensibility to my work, because I realized that readers needed to understand and be able to personalize the problems. Because I also learned from Trinity that these are not problems that were easy to solve. There had been damage done, and there was a time I finally had to say, you can't stay here because I couldn't trust her anymore. And these are the rules, and if you won't follow the rules, this is the way it is. And so I realized these problems are bigger and more complicated than we know, and the only way to know that is to put people at the center and to tell these stories. And the people that should be getting awards are some of the people who have opened their lives up and let me tell their stories. There's Chanel Walton, who was a woman who was raised in foster care, had 5 kids by the time she was 30, lost her kids because she was living with an ex-convict who was dealing cocaine, mentally ill, could never get help. And I chronicled that and chronicled people's efforts to help her. And I realized, I kept thinking there would be some resolution at some point and something would happen. But I realized that every place she turned, a door was closed. And that this was not going to be something that wound up. And she, let herself in for a lot of ridicule by some people and punishment for rule breaking by the authorities, but she opened herself up and let me tell her story. And I thought of this when I thought of archives. I started just, thinking about all the people whose stories I've been able to record. There was Alan Weeks, who was a gay man who was probably now almost 90, And he wrote after I wrote a column about a young boy in Central California who was shot to death at 15 for being too flamboyantly gay in middle school. And Alan Weeks talked about what it was like to be gay 65 years ago. And you know, the pain and all, and it was just a way that we today, when we're talking about gay marriage and things, could never have imagined. And it took incredible courage. And one of the bad things about the way the newspapers evolved, where you now have public comment sections, it meant that anybody like that tells their story is going to get you know, humiliated in the public comments section. But it didn't stop people like him. Tina Levine, whose story I told not long ago, who wrote to me, she's mentally ill, and just wanted to say how much it hurt to go to her local Starbucks and have the manager pull her aside and say, you can't come in here anymore because you make people nervous. And she said, I don't know what I do. Do I talk too much? Do I get too close? What do I do? And she just talked about struggling with, she had 3 different diagnoses and trying to, and this was a woman with a PhD in literature, and trying to live as normal a life as she could, and about just kind of what hurt. You know, it hurts my feelings to know that people don't get me, and the domestic violence victims and the runaways who talked to me about their stories and what it was like. The Korean psychiatrist who called after we wrote about the Rodney King riots, as we called them, to say, no one tells our story, and the pain and the suffering that the Korean community went through, and how in their culture, someone needs to say, we're sorry this happened to you. And why in America can we not say, we're sorry? It wasn't about reparations, it was just about acknowledging what they went through. And then again recently, when we wrote about the 1965 riots, to get a call from the children of Jewish shopkeepers who were making a living there and who lost their businesses and lost their livelihoods, and they just became the footnote, the collateral damage. And so the chance to tell all of these stories and have these people stand up and come forward and be willing to speak, it made me realize how important that is. And again, that's where access comes in, and we don't always have access, and where the value of storytelling comes in. I worry sometimes that you know, investigative reporting is wonderful, and I think Spotlight was great, and I remember all of that. But I think also we lose if we lose the stories of people, ordinary people who have something to say and something to teach us and can introduce us to issues and make us care about them, because you know, I have learned that people are good and they want to help. And in fact, Chanel Walton said something to me that I think a lot about. She said, you know, she made many, many mistakes in raising her children, and she would acknowledge them. And she said, she would always say, well, you only know what you know. And this is somebody, again, who was raised in foster care, all, you know, family all split up. She said, if I knew better, I'd do better. And I thought that's true for all of us. I think if we know better, we'll do better. And if we knew about the challenges that people face, if we knew about the circumstances they've overcome, if we knew about the roadblocks that are in their way, we might do better too. And as a people, and as a country, and as a culture, there is no time now, no time more than right now, I think that it is important that we do better. And I hope I can contribute in some other way to that, but I just hope we leave that with this message that we know better, and it's time to do better. And we have questions. This is always my favorite part, so you can ask me anything.
Just hold your hand up. I have a mic for you. We have some time for Q&A.
Thank you so much for your presentation. The question I have is, were any of your columns ever censored and told not to publish by your publisher?
No. There was pushback on some. And there was a lot of pushback that sometimes I didn't get what they wanted me to get. Like even the last time, as we just did the 1965 riot stories, there's a big push. Newspapers have to be profitable, and we have to get those young readers who aren't reading anymore. And the story I did, and the story I was most interested in doing, were elderly people that lived in the area during the riots, and their stories of, these weren't the Molotov cocktail throwers, they were the regular people. And I got pushback, and they wanted me to find young people. Let's go to the schools and see what the young people think about it, which is fine, but that's not what I wanted to do. I think that we need a record of what it was like, because it strikes me, my family, my mother's from Alabama, my father's from Georgia. My father's family came to Cleveland. He was born in 1913. He was about 10 when they came. Just a few steps ahead of a lynch mob who was going to get his older brother for wearing a suit and walking on the sidewalk and not moving when a group of white men came and told him to. My mother came, from a farm that had no running water, no electricity. It still had no running water and electricity when we would visit for the summer, which was interesting. But what I remember is driving down, and we'd drive down the south, we'd have the big caravan of all the cousins and all, and we'd always pack our meal. This is before there were big freeways, so it took 2 days, and we'd have to pack like big coolers of food, and when it came time to stop, we'd have to get off the freeway and drive into some town and go to something that looked like a house that was a hotel, and we would say, there's a Holiday Inn, why don't we stop there? And it wasn't until the year that we did stop at the Holiday Inn that I realized it was because we couldn't stop there. And when we were in Montgomery, near where my mother lives, and we would shop for clothes, we couldn't try on the clothes, my sisters and I. And we couldn't drink from the certain water fountains. And so it struck me that my generation are the last personal connection to what we went through. My kids still have trouble understanding. They think it's great Barack Obama got elected, yay. But they don't get, the tears and the sobbing, and they just don't get it. And so it's incumbent upon our generation I love how, sometimes I'll say to my daughter something about, in fact, one thing happened right here at USC. I was coming here for a speech once, and I had forgotten the parking pass I was supposed to give the guy, or the information, and when I pulled up to the parking thing, my daughters were in the car with me, I said, oh good, it's a black guy at the gate. And they were like, well, what difference does that make? I said, well, he just might let me in, which of course he did. And my daughter said, you are so racist. And that why does everything have to be about race? And I love that. I love that they have friends of every kind. They'd bring an interesting friend. I'd say, oh, what is she? They'd like, what are you talking about? And I love that, but I think it's really important that they know. My mother-in-law, she couldn't go past 6th grade, and she did 6th grade 3 times because she really liked learning. She was in Alabama too, and when she came, she put 5 boys through school, and when one of them wanted to drop out, she rode the bus to school with them every day and sat in class and said, you are not stopping. But among her grandchildren, 2 of the boys dropped out. One, kind of ran with the rough crowd, wound up another young black man shot and killed. Another wound up going to prison. And it was really hard for her to understand that we sacrificed so much so that you could go to school and you could vote and you could get a job and you could do all these things. And I think that generation needs to be more connected with the struggles. And every group has their struggles. And we need to not let our children and their children forget that. So what you all do is really important. That's a really long answer to your question about whether, and the answer was no, they never forbid me from doing anything, so I would talk them into it. Yes. Well, thank you all very much. I know we have a long program. Do we?
I can take one more if we had one more question. Here's Joe Nunn.
Yes, I've read your column, and also there was a young African-American sports writer.
Adande.
Right.
Yeah.
And I noticed that when
Or
both,
Kurt Streeter, there are two, kind of. Kurt had a column.
okay, I'm thinking about Adande.
Adande, yeah.
Right, when he would write about race, he could write about a lot of things, but when he would write about race, the editorial letters that would come in the following week were really, really something to read, the denial that went on.
Yeah.
And you've written about that as well. I'm just curious, how do you handle dealing with that kind of feedback when it comes in such in a negative way?
It's really hard. And you know, I would not be honest if I didn't say that some of the toll of that is what led me to feel like it's time to leave, because it's only escalated now with social media and, you know, and the public comments and that kind of thing. It's really hard, but my kids help me with that too. They just say, you know, that's just one ignorant person or a million. But they did say, they used to say it makes them wonder, does this reflect a wider, you know, a broad swath of people? Like, does this mean that the guy in the elevator next to me might be thinking like some of these people that write and call you names? Or is this just a narrow band that is very, you know, loud? And this political campaign makes me raise that question myself. I mean, I don't know. But I will say the thing that made it worthwhile, and I did not like feeling like I had to be the only person to write about it, but I knew there were some things I was the only person that could say, and some of that would be harsh on the, you know, on black people too. We got to get it together, but I really treasure the people, and these were quite often older people, who would write to me with a question about race, and they would say, I don't want to sound racist, but I want to ask this. And they would be really, you know, just honest, heartfelt questions. And so I balance that, yeah, I'll take this heat and I'll, you know, do all that, because somewhere somebody is thinking about things differently. And one person, and I would try to answer those people. One guy that wrote me a nasty message, and I wrote him back and said that was uncalled for, and it hurt. And here's all I was trying to do, and he wrote a thank you card saying that was uncalled for and tasteless, and I'm really sorry. I hope you accept it. So, so the benefits of that were you could reach mine as long as you don't come. You know, I'll just tell this last story. I interviewed Barack Obama when he was a senator, because I was an editorial writer then. I had read his book, Dreams from My Father, and I heard him give the speech at the convention that year. He was so great. But I said when I read that book, this man is never going to win anything, because he talked about using cocaine, he talked about hating white people, he talked about, you know, all these bad things that people were not going to accept. And my editor said, well, why don't you call him and ask him about that? And I did, and he called back. And I said, how do you think that's going to resonate? I can imagine people blowing up these quotes. And he said, no, he said, I grew up with white people. He said, and I have a lot of friends of a lot of different races. He said, I think people are open to talking about these things, but you can't just come at them victim oppressor. Nobody wants to be constantly told that they're the bad guy in the equation. And he said, black people talk about it because we have to talk about it, because it's in our face. But we can have a conversation as long as we're not, creating a sense of kind of hostility. And that stayed with me, and I think that's true. I think that people are willing to talk about it. It's just that some people haven't had to talk about it. And the last part of that is then the next day, I get into work and I'm starting work and the phone rings, and I answer the phone, Sandy Banks, and I hear, hey, Sandy, it's Barack. And what he wanted to know was, he said he was afraid that his book would not resonate with black people, and that black people would say, oh, he's not black enough, and would not vote for him. So I just thought it was interesting that we all have all of these issues around that we are afraid to talk about. And the more we talk about it, and not in a Donald Trump fashion, the more we talk about it in a reasonable way, the more we're going to all grow and become kind of one, a unified force. So thank you all for having me here. This means a lot to me. Thank you.